I'm building a 1/12 scale model of a Sears kit house. Sears was selling house kits through mail order that customers could assemble themselves between 1908 and 1942. This small house would have been popular around 1913 and was about 500 square feet in size. I'm going to be finishing the wall that divides the kitchen from the bedroom. I'm going to be putting wainscoting on the kitchen walls. And in this video, I'm going to be showing you how I made my wainscoting, and I'm going to be sharing my 6 best tips and tricks that you can use when you're building your miniatures. Today, wainscoting is used more for decoration, but originally, wainscoting had a very practical purpose in these old houses. So what is wainscoting anyway? Well, wainscoting are vertical boards that run along the bottom portion of the wall. There's usually a piece of molding that runs across the top of these boards, which was sometimes called a chair rail, or in cases where the wainscoting was quite tall, a plate rail or a plate shelf. In early houses, the walls were plastered using a method called lath and plaster. Small boards were attached to the wall running horizontally. Small spaces were left between these boards and the wall would be plastered. The plaster would flow in between these gaps and it would help to hold the plaster on the wall. The problem with lath and plaster is that it could take a long time for the plaster to dry, and in fact it could take several years for the plaster to completely dry so that the owner could apply the wallpaper to the walls. Sometimes if the ceilings weren't plastered properly, chunks of plaster would actually fall from the ceiling. Of course, shifting of the house as it settled would often cause cracks to appear in the walls. Hanging pictures on the walls was also difficult because hammering a nail into the wall could often cause the plaster to crack and even break with chunks of plaster falling out of the wall. Wainscoting was a way to protect the delicate plaster from getting damaged from the furniture and other items getting bumped up against the plastered walls. These old houses used knob and tube wiring, which could be a fire hazard, as it used rubber insulation which could become brittle and crack and even flake over time. If the wiring failed and a fire started on the walls behind the plaster, the wooden slats used to hold the plaster would make good fuel for the fire, and the fire would be hard to put out because the fire would be inside the walls. Here's a picture of a kitchen in an old house. Notice they've used wainscoting made from boards on the bottom half of the wall, and the top portion is made up of boards running in different directions to give the wall a decorative appearance. Also notice the electrical wiring for the light switch is on the outside of the wall and not inside the wall. These early kitchens didn't have many built-in cupboards as we have today. Kitchens would often have a standalone kitchen workstation called a Hoosier cabinet, like the yellow one I made for my model that I built. I'll put a link in the description so you can see how I built it from a scrap piece of 2x4. The kitchen in this photo would have been state-of-the-art for its time because the house had electrical wiring and running water. Notice the sink. There's no cupboards underneath the sink. If you were rich enough to afford indoor plumbing back in those days, you sure wouldn't want to hide the pipes under the sink. You wanted to show them off to your guests and your visitors to your home. Kind of like showing off a big screen TV today. Today we use gypsum board sheets to build houses. Gypsum board is a fireproof material making our modern homes safer, and it's way easier and faster to install. You don't need highly skilled tradespeople to plaster the walls. Sears was a pioneer in building techniques that we still use today, and Sears was one of the very first companies to employ gypsum sheets into the construction of their houses. I'm going to be using some popsicle sticks for the vertical boards of the wainscoting. This is the wall that I'm going to be finishing. I'm going to be using artist canvas for the top portion of the wall. It's basically a thin piece of wood covered with cotton canvas that people use for painting using oil or acrylic paints. Because the artist canvas has a bit of texture to it, it'll make the wall look like it's really made of plaster. Back in those days, people would often add sand or even horsehair to the plaster to give it a textured finish, so I think the artist canvas is going to work really well. The width of the popsicle sticks I'm using for the wainscoting is about 0.375 of an inch. 0.375 using our 1/12 scale, or 0.375 times 12 is approximately 4.5 inches wide. So in real life, these wainscoting boards would have been 4.5 inches wide. I did a video on miniature scales used for dioramas and other miniature projects. I'll put a link in the description if you want to check it out later. The height of the wainscoting from the floor to the top of the wainscoting is going to be approximately 4.5 inches, and in reality, that would be about 4'6". According to the description, Sears said the ceiling height in this particular house would have been 9 feet, so the wainscoting in this case will go halfway up the wall between the ceiling and the floor. Looking at the picture of the old kitchen, you can see the shelf on top of the wainscoting behind the wash machine, a handy shelf to store jars of preserved foods. Looking at this craftsman home, you can see the wainscoting goes up higher in the wall. The shelf across the top of the wainscoting here would be called a plate rail. It would have had little grooves to hold the plates upright so they don't fall off the shelf. Notice the beautiful dining room hutch. Built-ins were very common in craftsman homes during that time. It also had leaded glass doors with built-in lights on either side. I'm laying out the popsicle sticks to give you an idea of what the wainscoting will look like. One thing to bear in mind, when you paint the popsicle sticks, you won't really see the gap between the wood. A characteristic of wainscoting is that you can see the grooves between the vertical boards. So here's tip number 1. I'm taking this into account, and I'm going to be sanding the edges of all the popsicle sticks to give them a bit more of an angle so that there will be more of a gap appearing between the popsicle sticks. I laid a sheet of fine grit sandpaper onto my work surface, holding the popsicle sticks at approximately a 45-degree angle. I sanded the edges so that the front surface would have a slight angle to it. This will create larger gaps between the wainscoting boards, giving it a more realistic appearance. Hey, if you're enjoying my video, please click the like button and maybe even consider subscribing. That'd be awesome. As a small YouTube channel, it really helps me out. Here you can see I have on the left-hand side the popsicle sticks with the 45-degree angle versus the popsicle sticks that weren't sanded at all. You can see the increased space between these two pieces of wood. It took quite a bit of time to sand each of the popsicle sticks individually, but I think in the long run it's going to be worth it. It's going to really improve the appearance of my miniature. Finally, I got these popsicle sticks all sanded down, and it's kind of a wet, rainy day today, so I'm going to stay inside my garage and work on my miniature. This is the wall that will divide the kitchen from the bedroom. I'm going to be finishing the kitchen side of the wall with the wainscoting along the bottom portion of the wall using some popsicle sticks. And I'm using the artist canvas for the top of the wall. The middle of the wall is going to be divided with some miniature molding that I purchased. So here you can see if I lay the artist canvas down on the wall, it's much thicker than the popsicle sticks. So I'm going to be using a couple of popsicle sticks or craft sticks glued to the beams of the wall, and then gluing the popsicle sticks to those pieces of wood. This brings the height of the wainscoting to the exact same height of the artist canvas, giving the wall an even surface. I'm using some miniature molding which will divide the two portions of the wall. I'm going to be using a wider craft stick for the baseboard molding of this wall. I did an in-depth video about miniature baseboards and my tips and tricks, which I'll put a link for you in the description. Here you can see I laid everything out to give you an idea of what the wall will look like when it's completed. So let's get started with the gluing. I'm using a bandsaw to trim the craft sticks which run horizontally across the wall. These craft sticks will be glued to the vertical studs of the wall, giving me something to glue the popsicle stick wainscoting boards to. I laid the craft sticks in place on the wall to make sure that I had them cut to the correct length. I used some wood glue to glue these craft sticks to the wall assembly. I checked where the top of the craft sticks would be on the wall. You don't want to get these pieces of wood up too high because the artist canvas needs to be glued to the top part of the wall assembly. So remember, keep the craft sticks a little bit lower than the height of your wainscoting. The wainscoting is going to be about 4.5 inches from the floor. In reality, that would be about 4'6" in real life. The height of the ceiling is 9 feet according to the plans that Sears provided. So in other words, the house would have had 9-foot ceilings or 9 inches high in my model. The wainscoting will go approximately halfway up the wall. If we look at this photograph of the old kitchen, you'll see that the wainscoting is fairly high up the wall. This way the washing machine won't damage the wall if it accidentally gets bumped against the wall. And it's a good height where you can put a shelf on top where you could store plates, or in this case they're storing some jars of preserves. Here you'll see that I marked with some pencil lines where the top of the wainscoting meets the plastered portion of the wall. I'm placing the horizontal pieces of wood just slightly below these lines by about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch approximately. If you watched my previous video, I talked about the famous miniature tea grannies that are located at Murchie's Tea Shop in Victoria, British Columbia. I mentioned the famous Queen Victoria blend tea created by John Murchie for Her Majesty. This blend of tea is still sold today. I decided I would have a cup of this famous tea while I'm working on my miniature today. I'll leave a link at the end of this video to the video I made about the famous tea grannies. You just need to give it a click if you want to check it out. It's really quite fascinating. The glue's dried now and I can start assembling the wainscoting and gluing the pieces of wood to the wall. So here's tip number 2. Put a slightly thicker piece of wood along the base of the wall and have it held in place with some clamps. I'm holding it in place with these clamps. This will create a little ledge so that the wainscoting boards are all positioned exactly in line, giving me a row which is completely straight at the top and bottom. And here's tip number 3. Use a square to make sure you get the first piece of wainscoting at a right angle to the bottom of your wall assembly. This will ensure that your wainscoting doesn't look crooked on the wall. Carefully check each popsicle stick to make sure you get the right side face up. That's the side you sanded with the 45-degree angle. So here I am carefully placing the first popsicle stick at a right angle. This is really important because if you get the first one wrong, then every piece of your wainscoting will not be straight on your wall. Carefully, I put a dab of glue on each of the horizontal boards that I'm affixing the wainscoting to. Be very careful when you attach each board of wainscoting because you don't want to bump the other piece and make them crooked. I checked again using my square to make sure that I didn't inadvertently get the second piece of wainscoting crooked. And then I added some glue and prepared to add the third piece of wainscoting to the wall. It's okay if you start affixing your wainscoting from the center of the wall. It makes it a bit easier. I'll trim the last pieces at either end to make sure it fits perfectly. You'll notice I didn't cut the tops and bottoms of these popsicle sticks square. That's because I'm going to be putting another piece of wood across the bottom. I'm using a wide craft stick, which will be the floor molding, and then across the top of the wainscoting, where the wood meets the artist's canvas, I'm going to place a piece of miniature molding so you won't see the parts of the popsicle stick that are rounded. Here you can see that I've got the popsicle sticks glued in place. I removed the clamps that was holding the board across the bottom of my floor assembly. And here's tip number 4. It's always a good idea to try and paint as many parts of your model before you assemble them. I mentioned this in my video about painting tips and tricks. I'll pop a link to that video in the description so you can check it out later if you want. I cut the piece of miniature molding to length and I'm painting it, so I just need to glue it to the finished wall assembly when I'm ready. Here you can see the baseboards. I glued the baseboards to the bottom portion of the wainscoting, and I'm checking the depth to make sure that the artist's canvas fits exactly and is the correct thickness. I want a nice flush finish for my wainscoting. Everything looks pretty good. I took the plastic wrap off the artist's canvas. And here's tip number 5. You might not have gotten your wall perfectly square, so if I just measure the piece of artist canvas, it won't fit perfectly. So here's my tip. Trace the size you need by using the wall assembly as a template. I'm using my bandsaw to cut the artist canvas to size. I'm not going to use the miter guide because the lines aren't truly square, because my wall isn't perfectly square. I placed the cut piece of artist canvas on the wall assembly and it fit perfectly. I laid a piece of miniature trim between the top of the wall and the wainscoting and it looks really good. And here's tip number 6. This tip is from my painting tips and tricks video. The link will be in the description. I purchased sample sizes of paint for my miniature projects. It costs less and saves money compared to purchasing a whole quart or liter of paint, and it makes it easier than trying to mix your own colors. I painted the artist canvas with this nice light blue color. Make sure you give it a thin coat and not a really thick coat because I want to make sure that the texture of the artist canvas comes through to the finished wall. Remember, they would have sometimes mixed horsehair or even sand into the plaster to give the walls texture. After painting the artist canvas, I glued it and the miniature molding to the wall assembly. Notice how the light catches the grooves on the wainscoting boards and gives the wall a much more realistic appearance. That extra sanding really paid off. And you can see the texture on the blue portion of the wall. The artist canvas gives the wall texture, making it look like it's really made from plaster. And there you have it. The back wall and the kitchen is finished, and the wainscoting looks great. Hey, there's the video I told you about earlier. The one about the antique miniature tea grannies built over 100 years ago. Give it a click, you don't want to miss it. We'll see you in the next video.